Conversations. Thank you. That always comes right at the right time. This is our Community Conversations Anti-Racism Book Club, Turning the Page. This is our second session discussing the book by Jonathan Metzl, Dying of Whiteness. I'm Christina Bridges. I'm a researcher in family medicine and community health, and my co-host is
Jason Glenn, Associate Professor in Department of History and Philosophy of Medicine.
Great. So we always like to start this session, this discussion, by reminding ourselves, why do we do this every month and come together and have a discussion, reading these books that are talking about the history of racism in America and how that impacts our health system. And it is to understand the history, the patterns, and the systems, a place to practice talking about racism and racial inequities. It's a place for personal learning and growth to create a shift within ourselves, and it will inevitably provoke an emotional state, whether that's discomfort, empathy, or outrage. And this ultimately raises our consciousness, with our goal being committing to action and systems change. So, Dr. Glenn, do you want to just briefly reintroduce the author and kind of the main thesis on the next slide?
Sure. The author of this book, Jonathan Metzl, you all have probably heard his name often, not only because of him being a Kansas City native, but he is also co-author with a seminal article with Helena Hansen on teaching structural competency. He is trained as a sociologist and a psychiatrist, and currently the director of the Center for Medicine, Health, and Society at Vanderbilt University. And, has done a lot of good work in not only the history of medicine, but thinking about the social and structural determinants of health. Has also written a book called Against Health, which on the face of it, you like, who would be against health? But he actually talks about in the book sort of the ways that sort of health imperatives and the way that we engage patients around health imperatives can actually be unhelpful sometimes, and particularly to specific vulnerable populations. He conducted the study for this particular book, Dying of Whiteness, in the states of Kansas, Missouri, and Tennessee. So all the stories that he's collected in this book really hit close to home. The major thesis of the text is how the conservative culture war politics and policies that most appeal to working class white Americans in many ways end up making particularly working class white lives harder, sicker, and shorter. And it's a revelation in ways that we don't often think about how a lot of these policies may impact our health. We often talk about how they impact the health of vulnerable populations, but we don't often think of working class white Americans as, the top of our list in vulnerable populations. And the purpose is really to get the persons who most endorse some of these most unhelpful policies, right, to see the impact on their own lives. He spent 7 years collecting stories and health data in Kansas, Missouri, and Tennessee, states that endorse, right, so many of the anti-solidarity and racist dog whistle policies aimed at punishing the quote unquote minorities who gaming the system or the undeserving poor. And we have for you here, right, like who are those, right, or what are those policies, right? In essence, blocking healthcare reform, blocking Medicaid expansion, tax cuts for the middle class and wealthy, infrastructure divestment in our communities. And for today, one of the ones we're going to focus on is the relaxed gun restrictions. As he explains, psychologically and emotionally, these policies feel like a win for conservatives, but those policies end up being as dangerous for working class white people as things like asbestos poisoning or secondhand smoke exposure, right? Or even not wearing seatbelts.
Do you want me to take it from here?
Did you plan to take it from here? I
Sure,
can't.
I'll take it from here.
All right.
So as Dr. Glenn said, we're going to focus today. The first section in his book is focusing on talking about guns, and specifically in relation to preventing gun death and gun suicide. So just a warning, we will be talking about gun violence and particularly gun suicide. And so in the book, he talks about how politicians have gotten, like Dr. Glenn said, working class white folks really to rally around state laws to relax gun restrictions as being about personal safety, protecting Second Amendment rights, and the right to conceal and carry. And, the passion from white people for gun ownership are animated by a racist fear or fantasy of being attacked by a criminal. And this is especially people of color. But in actuality, relaxed gun laws have all these impacts on community health, increasing the number of suicides, accidental shootings, police shootings, and most profoundly, the largest increase is in the number of white men who get shot in suicide attempts. And there are 40,000 gun deaths in the US every year, and about 2/3 are from suicide. Of all the suicides by gunshot, white men overwhelmingly account for the majority, about 80%. And so making guns easier to procure raises the number of white men who will die from suicide. And because white men own so many guns and have them in their homes for protection, that's how they've been sold, then it becomes just an easy, accessible way and something that they reach for in moments of extreme despair. So part one, like I said, focuses on Missouri. And so he traveled all around Missouri, spoke to people around Kansas City, and Columbia, and Jefferson City, in St. Louis, but mostly he focuses on the southeast region of the state around Cape Girardeau. That is a place that I'm very familiar with because I actually went to high school down in this little tiny place, Risco, Missouri, population 500. And even though it doesn't seem that close on the map, this is such a rural area down there that Cape was actually the closest mall. So we would go there often. And just for context, there's little Christina in high school. But as he's describing kind of the gun culture down in that area, he talked about, he got there to Cape and he just saw, everyone's wearing camo and it was just very clear that this was, gun country. But, to me, I thought, I don't really remember it being, that much, but when I read a little further, it made sense. So he describes sort of the history of the gun laws in Missouri. And so in the 90s, when I was there in high school, we actually had, I didn't know this at the time, among the strictest handgun laws in the nation, including the requirement to go to the sheriff's office in person to do your background check and get a permit to have a handgun. Well, then he says, in the early 2000s, there was increasingly pro-gun legislature and citizenry. And this really shifted to relaxed limitations on practically every aspect of buying, owning, and carrying guns. In 2007, importantly, they repealed the permit to purchase, PTP law. And we'll kind of talk about that a little later. In 2014, Missouri voted to add Amendment 5 to the state constitution, which, quote, protects, quote, unalienable rights of citizens to keep and bear arms, ammunition, and accessories associated with the normal functioning of such arms for the purpose of defense of one's person, family, home, and property. And then in 2016, when he was writing this book, There was Senate Bill 656, which actually overturned a governor veto, and that eliminated requirements for training, education, background checks, permits, the requirement for a permit for concealed carry, expanded the so-called castle doctrine, which is implying that a man's home is his castle and he may protect it, and then also expanded the stand your ground, which says that if you are feeling threatened by someone even outside of your home, you may use a firearm. I looked it up today and I was reading, it also mentioned for healthcare workers that healthcare workers could not be required to ask about gun ownership, even if it was related to potential violence or health, could not be asked to use electronic health records that required entry about gun ownership, and something else I forgot, but specifically couldn't ask about gun ownership. Seemed scary. And so even though, like at the time that these laws were changing, some of the research around gun violence was showing that actually repealing, like in the 2017 repeal of the permit to purchase, what it was, permit to purchase law was associated with a 25% increase in firearm homicide rates, even though this was meant to reduce crime or protect people. Between 2008 and 2014, Missouri gun homicide rose to 40% higher than the national average. And in 2014, for the first time ever, gun deaths in Missouri topped deaths by motor vehicle. And so, he talks about all of these facts and data, but he's also sharing stories that he gathers as he's going around and talking to folks. And it's really heartbreaking. He spends a lot of time talking with, he goes to the support group in Cape Girardeau that is, those family members of victims of suicide, and all of them are victims of gun suicide and have been for the past 5 years. They said that's been like the number one suicide method. And he talks to folks and they're in so much pain, and the stories that they tell are so heartbreaking about their children or their parents, and they're all kind of expressing these same ideas of like, how could I not have seen the signs, or what could I have done differently? How could I have prevented this? Someone said, I would do anything to help other people so they don't have to go through this. And, what could we possibly do differently? But then he kind of got up the courage and he didn't want to try to sound too political or anything, but he got up the courage to just ask them about, well, have your experiences in any way with this changed the way that you might think about the role of guns? And everyone said, no, it's not about the guns. I don't think, quote, I don't think any of us blame the gun, or it's not the gun's fault. I own guns. Guns are important to us and our liberties. Heck, I'm teaching my nieces to shoot in case they need to protect themselves. Another one said, we pass down guns in our family, very strong NRA. And then I'm totally pro-gun and always will be. And so even though they are experiencing the anguish of, their family members dying by gun suicide, none of them think that it's about the guns. And so, Metzel's a researcher, and he says, typically, I'm going to read a little bit too, because I always like to do that. Typically, if there's something that is a cause of death, whether it's disease or any kind of cause of death, we do a lot of research around it to understand, what is the risk? What are some things, what are interventions we could do to prevent? So he says on page 36, in pretty much all other forms of suicide, except suicide by firearm, researching risk appears rather straightforward. Researchers develop a hypothesis based on their areas of expertise, apply it for funding, and map trends. For instance, researchers in psychiatry map suicide patterns using frameworks of psychiatric diagnoses. Are people with major depressive disorder more likely to try to harm themselves? Substance abuse experts assess the impact of drugs and alcohol or prescription medications on suicidal behaviors. Does drinking increase the risk of suicide? A researcher might ask. Public health scholars and health policy experts study the best methods for intervention when people are potentially suicidal. Looking over demographic data, they might ask, what kinds of targeted suicide prevention strategies work with what kinds of people? And then he says, what if suicide researchers are barred by their own government from obtaining federal funding to research or compile data about the leading method of lethal suicide in the United States, the method of suicide that kills more Americans than all other intentional means combined, including hanging, poisoning, overdosing, jumping, suffocating, or cutting, the method that kills more Americans than all of murderers, robbers, terrorists, and attackers put together as well. And he says, well, actually, this is true. This is not a what if scenario. So the Dickey Amendment was inserted as a rider into the 1996 spending bill, the United States federal government. And this mandated that none of the funds made available for injury prevention and control at the CDC may be used to advocate or promote gun control. And so this was due to lobbying by, in large part, the NRA, and it was named after the Republican representative from Arkansas who put this in. And the result was for about 2 decades, from 96 until it just changed in 2018, the CDC avoided all research on gun violence for fear it would be financially penalized. And so Congress, just in 2018, clarified the law to allow for research. And in 2020, the spending bill for the first time since 96 earmarked gun violence prevention money. And the result of this was that similar restrictions were put on the NIH, the National Institute of Mental Health. Federal funding for firearm injury prevention fell 96% over 15 years. Metzel says, quote, a 2017 analysis published in JAMA found that gun violence was the least researched major cause of death in the US, as measured by the number of papers published, and the second least funded cause of death related to its death toll. It was as if someone placed a silencer on knowledge. Okay. I wanted to read something else. He says, and I feel similar, as a researcher, it's hard not to get frustrated about this foolish and misguided ban and the censorship it produces when you sit in a meeting of people who have lost family members to suicide. The frustration is not because you're pro-gun or anti-gun or whatever. Most people, for the most part, are both depending on the context, myself included, and this binary of pro or anti feels forced and oversimplified in relation to the real world in any case. Rather, the frustration arises because it will be increasingly difficult for researchers to study what balanced suicide prevention might look like in parts of the country, like Cape Girardeau, where there are so many guns in people's daily lives. Because of the ban and its downstream effect, researchers rarely study why a small number of gun owners choose to turn their guns on themselves, while many others don't. They cannot determine the most effective points of intervention to prevent death among lawful gun owners or within particular social networks. They cannot compare various safe storage methods in rural communities to find out whether gun lockers, trigger locks, or smart gun technologies work best in households with guns and with children. In other words, the federal ban on funding gun research and the polarization it produces makes it harder to create common knowledge about some of the issues that most affected the people in the room in the Cape Library. And so gun suicide or using guns to attempt suicide is so different than other methods of suicide because of its inherent deadliness, ease of use, and accessibility if guns are in the house. Metzel says, for instance, 85% of gun suicide attempts result in death. Compare that to the leading cause, or the leading method, I should say, in suicide attempts, which is drug overdose. Only 3% result in death. And so it's so effective. He says that gun suicide can fall into a category experts call impulsive. a spontaneous response to an immediate stressor, so a breakup, job loss, fight, or rejection. And what researchers know about impulsive suicide is that a quarter of young people who attempted impulsive suicide spent less than 5 minutes thinking about it, making the decision to do that, and 70% spent less than 1 hour. And that the risk factors for impulsive suicide were male sex, history of physical fight, but not depression. So it's different. And this led a Harvard public health report to call gun suicide an irreversible solution to what is often a passing crisis. And this risk of death by gun suicide is very clearly a problem for white men. I mean, non-gun suicide attempts are diversely distributed among races and genders. But if you look at gun suicide, which is the most deadly, a study looking at 2009 to 2015 showed that non-Hispanic white men accounted for 80% of gun suicides, even though they were just 35% of the population. In 2010, white people, a different study showed white people were 25% of the victims of gun homicide. They were 65% of the population. And then the opposite is true for Black people in the US, making up 55% of gun homicides. And that includes run-ins with the police and other homicide, and only 13% of the population. So it's clear that white people are overrepresented in gun suicide. Another study showed, of white gun deaths, 77% is suicide and 19% homicide. And then the opposite for Black gun deaths, 14% suicide, 82% homicide. Okay, so there's an overrepresentation in gun suicide for white people, and an underrepresentation in gun homicide. All right, Dr. Glenn, I'm gonna pitch it back to you.
All right. So one of the case studies he uses, or an example, is this 2010 ad campaign by Bushmaster, whose parent company is Remington. Metzel analyzes how gun ownership has been symbolically linked to masculinity, and especially white masculinity, in such a way as to make the issue of gun ownership inextricably intertwined with racial identity politics in the US. And the .223 caliber semi-automatic rifle featured in this ad is the civilian version of what US soldiers were using in Iraq and Afghanistan at the time. Next slide. This is a fuller version of the ad that asks, what is a man card, right? And notice the, ingenious, sinister, right, rhetoric that is being used here. In a world of rapidly depleting testosterone, the Bushmaster man card declares and confirms that you are a man's man, the last of a dying breed, with all the rights and privileges duly afforded. You carry it in your wallet, ready to show at a moment's notice, instantly ending the discussion for any who would doubt you. Adam L. is just unmanly. Adam L. decries the eating of red meat while extolling the virtues of soy-based substitutes for pretty much everything else on earth. Man, hard revolt. And so what the website directed you to do was answer a few questions. And if you answered them correctly, you could be sent a man card, right? And these were the questions that they wanted you to ask, or that they wanted you to ask or answer. Do you think of tofu as an acceptable meat substitute? Can you change a tire? Have you ever watched figure skating on purpose, right? The on purpose part really got to me. I found that particularly hilarious, right? A car full of the rival team's fans cuts you off on the way to a championship game. What do you do? All right. The implication that if you do nothing and let them be on about their way, you're not really a man's man. And after users complete the quiz, their card or their man card is issued to them via download or email or in worst case scenario, some snail mail. And the back of the card would read, "Today he is a man, fully entitled to all the rights and privileges duly afforded." Next slide, please. This ad really flew under the radar for a while, but came to the fore as part of the events that unfolded down in Sandy Hook, right? And last year around this time, Remington Arms reached a $73 million settlement with the families of the victims of the 2012 massacre at Sandy Hook Elementary School, in which 20-year-old Adam Lanza shot and killed 20 children and 6 staff members. Some of the victims' family sued Remington Arms, arguing that they violated state consumer laws based on their advertising of the weapon used in the shooting, which was that same Bushmaster 223 caliber AR-15 style rifle. And at particular issue was that very man card ad campaign. The aggressive marketing strategy used by Remington, the plaintiffs contended, directly targeted at-risk youth like Adam Lanza. Next slide, please. So this is Adam Lanza in 10th grade. This is before he gets his man card. You see him there on the left, pocket protector and all, right? Sort of classic, quote unquote, nerd profile for a high schooler. On the right, that's him with the tech club where all the geeks hung out, right? Also classic, like, you know, you're not getting a man card based on Remington Arms' definition. Next slide, please. This is Adam once he got his man card. You see him there fully doled out in pseudo military gear with his AR-15 style rifle in tow. That's the one he's holding. There's another one strapped to his back. Can't really tell what kind that is. These were images that were on his computer. Next slide, please. And important to note, right? Before attempting to commit police or suicide by police, he was contemplating committing suicide himself. And that's one of the things that Metzel doesn't get into as clearly, right? That some of our mass shootings, not just the suicides, but the mass shootings are oftentimes attempts to commit suicide by police, right? By first taking out a whole lot of other people. And Adam Lanza really fit that profile. Next slide, please. So this opens up for Metzel an opportunity to talk about the tradition of marketing guns to white men. Since the 19th century, gun manufacturers have aggressively marketed their products to white men, and especially young ones. In the 18th and 19th centuries, right, highly trained gunsmiths were making guns on an individual level, right? They were custom and crafted for individual buyers. However, a large civilian market for mass-produced weapons did not exist before the 1840s. The Industrial Revolution, of course, changed all this, right? And it ushered in these expansive factories that made it possible to rapidly make and assemble both rifles and revolvers. However, mass production, or the ability to mass produce guns, created a problem for prospective gun tycoons, right? That producing lots of guns cheaply and efficiently would only be profitable if there was a huge market for them, right? So the solution they came up with was an aggressive advertising campaign. And instead of the public seeing guns as largely for military use or as household tools, Americans had to begin to desire guns for their own personal use. Enter the revolver handgun. Samuel Colt exemplified, right, the art of selling guns on unregulated markets in the US. His greatest invention, of course, was the manufacture of the repeating revolver and marketing, right, that made his guns the most popular, the most prolific and storied handgun in American history. And he, in doing so, implicitly connected his revolvers to ideas of white manhood and power. This came in the form of his inspiration for the handgun, right? Which was inspired by Nat Turner's slave uprising in Virginia in 1831. Colt was startled to think about the fearful odds faced by white planters due to being surrounded by a swarming population of slaves. And so he came up with the idea of a multi-shot revolver that would enable the planter, right, to, as he put it, repose in peace. In the late 1950s, he began urging his factory managers to run the armory at a double set of hands, right? Make hay while the sun shines, right? As the Civil War was looming on the horizon. And seeing the warlike mood in the South, Colt told his factory superintendent, Elisha K. Root, that he was sure there is a market for all the arms we can make, whether there is a fight or not. And of course there was, right? And, you know, Metzel talks about specifically in this history, the white privilege of gun ownership, and hark back to that Bushmaster ad campaign when it talks about the rights and privileges of having your man card, right? So Metzel highlights how for much of American history, by law and by custom, civilian gun ownership was a privilege afforded to white people in general and white men specifically, while restricted for everyone else, especially Blacks. And contrary to mainstream US historians that assert that the Second Amendment was solely concerned with government tyranny, he also puts forth the argument that it was also about protecting the social order and preserving white control over an enormous Black population and staving off Native American insurrections. Gun laws that secured the rights of whites and restricted those of slaves and free persons of color spread dramatically throughout the US, and particularly in the South in the early 1800s. And this was animated by concerns of violent Negroes. Many state Supreme Courts ruled that gun ownership was an exclusive privilege of white free citizenship. And this became particularly, right, like the legacy behind what many call the American disease, right? And so he details how the political emergence of the NRA went hand in hand with exponential growth in gun ownership. America's privately owned gun stock rose by over 70 million between 1994 and 2014. And then, of course, by 2015, American citizens owned over 255 million guns. So that's more than one gun for every adult in the entire country. But they're not evenly distributed like that, right? So Americans, put in another way, as less than 5% of the world's population, own 42% of the world's guns. And legal gun ownership has remained concentrated in white populations well into the 21st century. And particularly whites in states like Missouri remain disproportionately armed. He poses the question, why has gun ownership remained so highly concentrated by race and gender, right? Part of filling in that context, right, is explaining how in the 2010s, as Dr. Bridges was alluding to, a number of states, including Missouri, enacted a slew of gun everywhere bills, eliminating almost all restrictions on the rights to openly carry firearms in public places, including parks, airports, and hospitals. And the rhetoric of protecting self and family is often invoked, but Metzel found that those narratives were pervaded with racist anxiety. Case in point, this interview that he had where both Adam and Ruth made the following points, right? Adam said, you hear about carjackings. Let's say you pull up to a convenience store and there's some certain people outside that make you feel a little nervous. Then you've got your gun there to make yourself feel more comfortable. And then Ruth piped in to say, well, there was this car with like four young guys. They weren't white, Caucasian, they were darker skinned, I guess, dressed in really baggy clothes. I wish we had a gun with us. As Metzel explains, right, most of these racialized altercations never actually happened. Rather, white gun owners imagined these encounters based on anxieties about persons of color. And in such stories, gun ownership became a defense of internalized notions of racial order, as well as an external personal safety. Dr. Bridges, back over to you.
Thank you. So I just wanted to point out, he talks about a lot of research that was done looking at Missouri versus Connecticut, because the two states sort of took opposite trajectory when it came to gun law. So about the time that Missouri was relaxing all of their restrictions, Connecticut was tightening restrictions. So they, I think, both had that PTP, permit to purchase law, but Missouri got rid of it in 2017, and then Connecticut got stricter on other laws. And so he describes some research that was done that really closely looked at statistics from death data, from firearms between Missouri and Connecticut, but also many other states sort of as controls who didn't change their gun laws at all, and maybe some that had more restrictive and less restrictive. And really what they found was that Connecticut gun deaths went down and Missouri gun deaths went up. But he makes this specific point, or the researchers did, I guess, rather, that Missouri, they were able to calculate and estimate, exactly how many extra deaths occurred because of relaxing that PTP law between 2018 and 2015. And they calculated that it was 413 white men who died, 52 per year. And he says, to put these additional white male deaths in perspective, 52 deaths in a year would exceed the reported gun deaths by defensive use, home invasion, or accidental shooting in Missouri in every year since 2012. The 413 deaths over 8 years equals the total number of reported gun deaths from mass shootings in the entire United States in 2015. The number of additional deaths in Missouri between 2018 and 2015 dwarfs the number of Americans killed by terrorist attacks over the same period. According to a terrorism tracker produced by the nonpartisan New America Foundation, in the 15 years since 9/11, jihadists have killed 94 people inside the United States. According to the US Department reporting, 145 Americans died by overseas terrorism between 2017 and 2015, for an average yearly mortality rate of 18, while 70 Americans died via domestic terrorism over this 8-year period, for an average yearly death rate of 8.75. And according to a database on death, the total number of persons killed by terrorism in Missouri between 2008 and 2015 was 0. And so although white men are being sold these guns for protection, at the same time, crime was actually going down between the 90s and the mid 2000s, when they were deciding to reduce all of these, and their suicide was going up, and it outpaced all of the concerns they were worried about protecting against. So we want to give time now to discuss. I jotted these down. We were brainstorming yesterday, and so these were just some of the thoughts we had. Just very simple questions, that we could address here. But we wanted to highlight that it's important for us to know the facts here, know the statistics, and understand all of this. But there's a bigger, it's a much bigger idea at play, right? Because other people can pull out facts and, sort of be won over, but it goes deeper, right? And so I don't know if you told that group of, grieving family members all of the facts, if that would be enough to change how tightly they're holding on to, we must protect our liberties and our gun laws, or prevent against gun laws. And so really it's this bigger idea of, disentangling our identities with, from racism, and also thinking about, what are the ideas, like, that perhaps we've been sold, or the things that we're holding on to, like guns, because of racism. And Dr. Glenn, do you want to talk about this last one?
Sorry, I had to take myself off mute. We talked about, right, how our identities of what it means to be human, and how we think about self and other are inextricably tied to the systems of meaning, the cultural systems of meaning that we exist within. But recognizing that, humans can't exist outside of cultural system of meaning. How do we change it, right? At the same time, when we find that our system of meaning is detrimental to us and the way that we live our lives, or at least detrimental to a large subset of the population, and in our case, also detrimental to the planetary environment, right? Detrimental to ourselves, even when we think that it's actually in our favor. So how do we achieve that kind of work, right? When we know that our identity is inextricably intertwined with this idea of race, how do we reframe the way we think about self and other such that it is no longer based on the notion of race? What would that take for us to do? And not necessarily thinking that we're going to solve that problem, here in this afternoon, but want to get people thinking about that, right? What would that mean? What would it look like? So I think we're going to break up into small groups now and discuss some of these questions in the next 10 minutes and see how far we get.